Thank you. Well, I think the lectures so far this morning have been a rich feast, so I hope I can not appear too superficial or banal in comparison. Okay, so our topic is discerning the signs of the times, marriage, family, and the person. And so I'd like to first refer just to a passage in Gaudium et Spes 3. Though mankind is struck with wonder at his own discoveries and its power, it often raises anxious questions about the current trend of the world, about the place and role of man in the universe, about the meaning of his individual and collective strivings, and about the ultimate destiny of reality and humanity. So this passage sums up a central aim of the council, maybe I guess the central aim, at least of Gaudium et Spes. The fathers sought to engage the modern world in awe at its own discoveries and power, and to engage in a kind of dialogue. What are the anxious questions about the trend of the world that are spoken of here? Of course, there were and are many. If the first line of the pastoral constitution begins with Gaudium et Spes, joy and hope, it immediately follows this basic Christian affirmation essential to the gospel with the other side, the grief and anguish of the men and women of our time. The pastoral constitution is clearly intent on addressing, as it says elsewhere, the urgent problems deeply affecting the human race. In other words, the grief and anguish, I guess. Now, it is not simply chance that has the council fathers make marriage and the family the first of their more specific concerns. This apparent priority no doubt reflects a number of cultural developments preceding the council, many of which had already been addressed 35 years earlier by Casti Connubii. The role and place of women, the growing normalization of divorce, the popular and religious acceptance of contraception, radically intensified by the then recent advent of the pill, and not unrelated to these problems, the increased emphasis on emotional or romantic love as the crucial foundation for marriage. It may seem that some of these questions are no longer our questions because history has determined their answer. Who questions today that the role and place of women is in the corner office rather than the kitchen, presumably making cookies, as Hillary Clinton once suggested? And yet our questions now are only these same questions intensified. If the offices and kitchens are indifferent to the gender or sex of the occupants, then have we not perhaps posited a general interchangeability of persons and sexes? And if so, then it is reasonable to think of marriage as two careerists sharing a bed, as Wendell Berry, I'm sort of a misquote, I think, of Wendell Berry. Then why must the careerist be of differing sex? From here, it is perhaps no longer shocking to find, as I did the other day, a news item concerning a girl who managed, with the help of a new app, of course, what else, to locate scores of brothers and sisters all sharing the same anonymous donor her lesbian mothers had selected. That the urgent problem of marriage and family presses ever more heavily on the church is evidenced by the fact that the Holy Father began by saying that he did not want to focus on a few moral issues, abortion, contraception, gay marriage, and so forth, but instead on the preferential option for the poor, only to have his pontificate dominated thus far by issues of civil divorce and remarriage, the pastoral accompaniment of homosexuals, and, I would argue, in the background of it all, the question of the contemporary viability or non-viability of sexual ethics is represented in Humanae Vitae. The most prominent evidence of this swamping of the bark of Peter by a few moral issues is, of course, the two recent synods of the family, with all the atmospheric turbulence that attended them. I will come back to the synods later. Marriage and the family constituted, and now constitute at an even more radical level, an urgent problem confronting the human race precisely for the very reason that they stand in the most violent way possible against the lust to dominate reality, to reject its sacramental or symbolic meaning that drives modern culture and has driven it from the beginning. Marriage and the family are simply the communal expression of what is written in the body, but the body always threatens to disclose who or what I am before I have made a choice, or contrary to my empirical experiences. My goal is to look at the problem through what we might call an epistemological lens. To explain my approach, I would like to make a rather loose appeal to the tried and true maxim that whatever is known exists in the knower according to the mode of the knower. I take this to mean two things in my loose interpretation. That in knowing something, our way of knowing will correlate in some ways with what we are. We'll have to correlate in some way with what we are. And that insofar as our knowledge really is of something true or real, really is knowledge, we must bear some likeness to it. Hence, people are capax Dei, or are capable of the knowledge of God precisely and only insofar as they are imago Dei. But of course, it goes in the other direction as well. To put it differently, reality as a whole is going to appear to me very much shaped by the way I understand myself and the source or sources of my existence. Now, the conventional way to say that modern metaphysics makes marriage and family problematic is to think that they are antagonistic, that the more general or fundamental matter is the metaphysics and that marriage and family are its victims. I would be the last to deny that this is an accurate depiction. However, my claim here is that the loss of an adequate sense of marriage and family has made it impossible to properly understand our world. At the very root of our being, there must be an ontological awareness of our structure as created, that is to say, as given and bearing our givenness as the basic structuring principle of our being. Otherwise, we will not be able to see our having been created as making a difference with respect to our being. Let's look back at Gaudium et Spes and the urgent problems. As already mentioned, one of the pressing issues was how to understand the recent advent of the pill. The question for many at the time was whether it should be thought of as a form of contraception, falling under the Church's traditional doctrine. Since the pill did not seem to obstruct or corrupt the marital act physically, the question was asked whether it contained the root moral evil present in previous forms of birth control. Rather than obstructing anything, perhaps the pill simply extends natural cycles of infertility. In the larger social context, some hailed the pill as the equivalent of the atomic bomb in its radical implications for human history. In the long run, its implications may be even more profound. Historian Rudolf Binion has suggested some of the implications. I get the citation of Rudolf Binion from Professor Shivanandan from a long time ago. Binion has suggested some of the implications of the widespread use of birth control and the consequent drop of fertility in France and America, starting at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries following the two revolutions. Indeed, he relates this drop in fertility, which apparently long baffled many historians, to the revolutions themselves. What the revolutions represent politically is mirrored in the home and within the spousal relationship. If birth control had always been associated with illicit sexual activity, after the revolution, it is invited into the marriage itself. It represents the personal autonomy of the spouses. But it also brings some new factors into play. For example, the phenomenon of the generation gap, in which the outlook and ideals of different generations seem to be irreducibly in tension. Or the extremely intense relationships that can develop between parents and the one or two children they may have. More interestingly, however, Binion goes on to discuss the later fertility drop in the rest of Europe, which he sees as giving rise to the dominant literary theme of marital familial dysfunction. Think of Ibsen's A Dollhouse, for example. More deeply, Binion proposes that the literary critique of marriage and family may represent a subconscious attempt to work out a mass or cultural guilt complex over the growing use of contraceptives. He also suggests that in the face of widespread use of contraception, the child no longer to appear to be quite necessary or naturally related to human love. Where this occurs, marriage and the family become unnatural impositions on love, as though society had imposed on free love a distorting, inhibiting, and inhuman structure designed to contain and define personality. So long before the pill, the fragmentation of marriage, family, and sexual difference was well underway. Yet the pill would nevertheless represent a kind of watershed. In distancing the act of contraception from the sexual act itself, the pill would also minimize the occasion of guilt. Indeed, it might make sterility come to seem the more natural state. The suggestion that marriage and family are unnatural, of course, is not an invention of the 19th century. It is suggested, for example, in classical liberal thought. Locke speaks of the husband-wife relationship as the first society and the one that gives rise to civil society. But he discusses marriage and the parent-child relationship, but when he discusses marriage and the parent-child relationship, they appear remarkably contractual. They seem to be conceived in the image of the civil contract to which he says they are preliminary. Where he does speak of family in non-contractual terms, it takes the form of patriarchy and therefore represents the absolutism, especially Catholic absolutism, he seeks to counter. Familial relations, as primordial and natural, are therefore more like a dark or menacing threat than a natural substructure for civil society. The idea of marriage and family relations as unnatural is reflected in American law as well. For example, the Supreme Court famously said in 1887 that marriage as the most important relation in life is having more to do with the morals and civilization of a people than any other institution, has always been subject to the control of the legislature. Like the parent-child relation, the court continued, marriage is not a contract but a civil status. Hence, its rights, duties, and obligations rest upon the general law of the state, which defines and describes those rights, duties, and obligations. The court then says that these depend on the sovereign will of the state. There is nothing here regarding marriage as a natural community. For the court, marriage rests entirely on civil legislation and the exercise of individual rights. The so-called right to marriage is nothing more than an individual right with respect to the civil institution of marriage as defined by the state. Hence, when the Supreme Court in 1972 affirmed the right of unmarried people to use contraception, it did so by first defining marriage as merely an association of individuals. It is therefore unsurprising that in the recent spasm of cases concerning gay marriage culminating in Obergefell, there are no natural marital or familial communities, but only biological and legal communities. Biological plus the legal is sort of this ersatz nature. But neither of these, nor both together, constitute a natural community. As Karol Wojtyła said, the biological order is not, in fact, a real order, but a product of the human mind in its abstraction of quantifiable elements for methodological purposes, from what does, in fact, have real and independent existence, namely nature and creation. Of course, the explicit rhetoric surrounding the Church's debate in the 1960s was different from this, but some of it was no less radical in its implications. Indeed, some of the implications are similar to those pointed to by Binion and suggested by American law. Consider the results of the famous Papal Commission on Birth Control, established by John XXIII and expanded by Paul VI. Rather than simply sticking with its mandate to examine how the pill related to the traditional teaching concerning birth control, the Commission went on to examine the whole of the doctrine concerning contraception. The change in the teaching regarding contraception, the result was the famous majority and minority reports. The majority, which advocated a change in the teaching regarding contraception, set about to answer the question of what makes contraception wrong. Their conclusion is typically modern. In itself, contraception is neutral, but it can be used in immoral ways, where a couple acts selfishly, for example. But it can also be used in generous and loving ways. More revealing is the argument as to why this is so. Inter alia, the majority resorts to a kind of theology of history and of the human vocation. God, in creating the world, set mankind over it to develop it. It is therefore part of the human vocation to bring order to the world, and modernity has allowed the imposition of this order on an unprecedented scale. Far from constituting a crisis for Christianity or presenting a set of problems for Christianity, modernity is the full realization of Christianity and its implication for man's relationship to God's creation. Schillebeeckx, for example, had spoken of modernity's elimination of the medieval traces of the pagan sense of nature's sacredness, and in doing so opening the way for man's free construction and the approach to God in holiness. If the body and its reproductive cycles is a natural given, humanity can rationalize these functions and thereby fully humanize them for the sake of a more humane life. In other words, the human body is fully humanized only by technological rationalization. Of course, the majority report would never dream of calling marriage or the family unnatural like 19th century literary figures. But in technologizing them, it does something analogous. It supposes that the body and its natural cycles are in fact only biological cycles, and that they are therefore part of a subpersonal material order, a given facticity, and as such are not yet fully human. Humanae Vitae, of course, went against the logic and conclusions of the majority's recommendations. It also answered the question of whether the pill is a form of contraception with the Church's teaching by means of its focus on intention in its crucial definition of contraceptive acts. But to define an evil act is not to say why it is evil. For this, Humanae Vitae famously put forward its inseparability doctrine. Contraception is evil because it separates what should never be separated, the unitive and procreative meanings or significations or real symbolic nature of the conjugal act. To put this more strongly, to separate these significations is to destroy the act's conjugality. Indeed, to act against one of the significations is, in fact, to act against the whole, and therefore, at the deepest level, both. A contracepted act is no longer truly unitive. Likewise, a non-unitive act, say IVF, corrupts the procreative meaning by conceiving the child according to the logic of production, as Donum Vitae put it, drawing specifically on Humanae Vitae's argument. Indeed, the teachings of Humanae Vitae on contraception and Donum Vitae on ARTs are only flip sides of the same problem. Indeed, this linking of the questions of contraception and reproductive technologies was already present in the thought and teachings of Pius XII. Both contraception and ARTs treat the body as a kind of raw datum that can be subjected to manipulation. If the widespread use of contraception lends itself to the widespread sense that marriage and family are not natural, ART simply extends the logic which already implicitly is present by suggesting that the conception of children and the parent-child relationship is also not natural. The effect of these developments is literally to carve a bourgeois outlook into the flesh and blood of familial relations. They make possible the odd tendency of modern liberal society to treat childbearing according to the model of consumer or lifestyle decisions, as though what was always considered a paramount civic good, the survival of society from generation to generation, can now be secured as a beneficial externality of private consumer choice. My epistemological point then is this. We have for a long time come to see what is in fact a primordial and creaturely, and on that basis natural community, as an imposition on what is taken as fully human, man as a combination of biology and will. But this starting point as the radical basis for understanding ourselves then dictates also how we can know the world. To see this more clearly, we might consider the flip side of contraception, ARTs. ARTs communicate to the parents, the child, and the whole community that the child owes his or her existence to a choice that is in principle detached from the act of love that is proper to the order inscribed in the mother's and father's bodies, an order that precedes any act of freedom on their part. ARTs therefore suggest that the child's beginning is rooted in technique and choice. But this is to subject the child's existence to the parent's free acts according to the logic of production. This is a very different sort of logic than that of the given or natural order. In normal conception, the child is not reducible in his or her beginning to an act of choice or technique. While parents certainly can and do choose to have children when they conceive in the natural way, in the sense that the conception of a child occurs in the context of a series of free acts, they do so from within the order given and inscribed in their bodies. Hence, the free acts, without in the least losing their character as free, are acts whose form is already in part given. In this sense, then, the child conceived naturally is already implicit in the act of love that is proper to marriage. The order of the family precedes the child, and indeed it even precedes the parents. In fact, the parents' choice can only occur in the form of a yes to what is already implicit within them. The child's source is therefore already contained within, and in a real way prior to, the parents' beings as mother and father. The child is therefore the fruit of the union of the mother and father, a union that already is a form into which they are drawn in their free acts. This means that even in their choosing to have a child, say because they are now in a better position to have a child, or even because they only have boys and they would like to have a girl, they are always in the position of receiving the child that is given within this order in which their free acts take their shape and constitute a yes. If they want a girl, but they get another boy, they might be disappointed, but being disappointed is not identical with the idea that a mistake has occurred. It does not logically lead, for example, to the conclusion that their methods need improvement. The givenness of the form of their acts as the union of the order of their bodies together means that they can only understand the child as a given, that is to say, as a fruit and not as the product of their love. They cannot in the least reject the child without simultaneously rejecting the order that offers the form to the acts that express and concretize their love. They cannot, in other words, reject the child without simultaneously also rejecting themselves, their love, and their marriage. In a way, they have to think that this was always the child of their love, even before the free act that allowed the conception to occur. Because of this, if the child turns out to be a boy rather than a girl, or an unhealthy baby instead of a healthy one, they are already related to and part of a whole, that is to say, a marital familial community with that child, because in this sense, they always have been. And as such, because this child was always their child, they must receive the child in those terms, just as they would continue to love and care for a child who later contracts leukemia. The natural order of the family then precedes the free acts of the spouses and is the basis for their love and its proper acts. The fitting togetherness of spouses is also and already a fitting togetherness of mother, father, child. It is a fitting togetherness that is inherently non-exchangeable, non-instrumental. It is an order that precedes any act of freedom, but which of course requires acts of freedom for its realization. ARTs follow an entirely different logic, that of production rather than reception. The logic of production suggests that the child is in fact reducible to the parent's choice plus technique. It is true that even here the action must take place within a given order. ARTs may use the couple's gametic cells to conceive a baby, biologically related, as it is put, to both parents. The equipment and techniques of the clinic and laboratory cannot be any set of random items and so forth. This only proves, however, that human beings cannot create ex nihilo. They always must start with something given. In fact, what it proves is that it is impossible for us ever to step entirely outside the order of nature in its fullest sense, or, as Dr. Schindler said last night, what is evil is always parasitic on the good. But ARTs are effectively the choice to take a crucial piece of or step in the conception of a child outside of the order of the given as it naturally pertains to the conceiving of a child. To take it from this order is to express that the child does not begin within it, which is to express the in principle separable relation between the coming to be of the child and the order proper to marital love. Even if the parents do in fact use, say, IVF with loving motivations, their act, and those of the various doctors and technicians involved, is in principle a separate sort of action from the order of love that is already given expression in their bodies and the acts proper to them. Hence, the child cannot be traced back to the order that gives rise to the acts of the love proper to marriage. The child cannot therefore be thought of as already implicit within those acts of love, even prior to the free choice of the parents. Hence also the child is traced back to the choice to exchange a piece of that order for what they believe is an equivalent. But the choice to use ARTs and the acts that ensue are only good or worthwhile as productive acts, as poiesis, rather than praxis. ARTs are the sort of act that is only engaged in for the product, not because the act is in itself good on its own terms. This is why, when it is not possible for one reason or another to use both or even either of the gametic cells of the couple, heterologous ARTs are a natural further step or concession. In any case, the particular piece that is removed is the order of fitting togetherness of the spouses, the order that is inscribed in their bodies, and the acts of love proper to their bodies, specifically as husband and wife. The receiving of the child is given the form of a process or production, beginning with raw materials. The implications of this logic are much larger than is often appreciated. First, there is the exchangeability of the body and its natural acts with technical acts and methods. But if the body and its acts can be replaced by the techniques and instruments of the laboratory, then the laboratory has been conceived as an equivalent to the body and its acts. To put it more graphically, not only does this express the idea that the laboratory can serve as, because it is on the same level, as it is on some level equivalent to a womb, it also says the womb is in principle reducible to a kind of mechanism, albeit less precise and more fallible than those tools we might develop by use of technological rationality. Second, there is the essential exchangeability of the child with a set of possible other kinds of child, as envisioned in the processes implied by production. When we take a piece or pieces out of the proper order inscribed in the body and the acts proper to it, we turn that piece into an object, which can now be manipulated. If we are going to use materials to produce a child with the equipment of the laboratory or the clinic, therefore, we can easily begin to think of the sort of child that we would like to have. It is not surprising, then, that ARTs so easily slip into the further implication of productive activity, namely quality control. It is an inherent character of technical productive activity that is being done well or badly as a question of the quality of the product. Insofar as we are considering the act precisely as a productive sort of act, and not simply as an instance of praxis, what concerns us most, by definition, is arriving as efficiently as possible at a result with sufficient quality. This focus on outcome therefore invites not simply wanting the child that comes, but wanting a child that is a certain way, a child with certain qualities. But this amounts to appropriating to oneself absolute dominion over another's nature and existence. Again, this result correlates with an understanding of the family's fitting togetherness as one of mechanistic utility rather than an integral whole. Of course, I have just tried to make this contrast with respect to the most difficult case, the loving husband and wife who are unable to have children naturally and seek the aid of medical technology. The fact of the matter is that the burgeoning fertility business is increasingly riding on the back of the gay rights movement. I read recently 70% of the business in artificial insemination is now lesbian couples and single women, wherein the natural foundation of the person and community is even more obscured. Like ARTs, homosexuality is also parasitic. There is only sexuality because of the male-female binary, and there is only the binary because of their correlation. And so homosexuality makes use of this correlative binary raw material to build personal identity, while simultaneously declaring that it lacks definitive significance as a vital source of personality. On the flip side of this parasitism and the general rejection of the body, and by extension the rest of physical reality, as possessing unavoidable symbolic significance for life, is the question of the source of identity. Hence, where the body is reduced to pure facticity, so too is personal identity. Identity becomes only my experience of myself and my life. Broadly speaking, the ethical task, according to the classical tradition, or at least my reading of the classical tradition, is the discovery of the truth of desire. But where the origins and destiny inscribed in the body are rendered non-symbolic, then they cannot be taken as a sign of this truth. Hence, the truth of desire simply becomes the pure facticity of my experienced desire itself. There is no way to penetrate that fact for its interior meaning. The truth of my identity, then, is only the empirical fact of my desire. Desire cannot then point beyond itself. If I understand myself as a product of choice and technique, rather than always already inscribed in the love of my parents, as given order and manifested in their bodies, then I also cannot understand reality as a whole as God's creative gift, because I cannot draw on the evidence of the body and my origins as a paradigm for all flesh, the whole of the world, which is summed up in the human person. In principle, my parents could have made the same choice and carried out the same actions with other raw materials. The fact that I see something of my father's and my mother's faces looking back at me each morning in the mirror begins to seem arbitrary, a function of the facticity of generative elements brought together by the wills of those involved, my parents, technicians, and doctors. And even if my origin is natural, where these practices begin to dominate, as they increasingly do, I begin to think of my natural origins as only an alternative to the lab. I have thereby been injured at the deepest level because my origins, or my way of conceiving them, has been injured. Nor if I cannot penetrate beyond the empirical to the truth of desire, can I ask very precisely about what I really desire. My origins appear to be the combination of the choice of my parents and raw materials. My destiny appears to be simply staying within the immediate experience of my desires. Most of the discussion surrounding the recent synods on the family centered on the question of admission to communion for those who attempt to enter into a second marriage following divorce, which was also the preoccupation of the Synod Fathers. Not very far in the background, however, were other important and related issues, especially the question of homosexual relationships. There were also many questions that were not specifically raised by the Instrumentum Laboris, or working paper, that bear heavily on the question of marriage and family in the modern world. This includes any sort of sustained response to ARTs. But perhaps at the center of all these questions is one that seemed to arise explicitly only at the margins. There seemed to be an appetite on the part of a substantial minority of the Synod Fathers to rethink Humanae Vitae. This desire seemed manifest in numerous passages in the Instrumentum. For example, the Instrumentum spoke of the unitive and procreative character of marriage, but this reference to Humanae Vitae is egregiously imprecise. Humanae Vitae, in fact, had spoken of the unitive and procreative meanings of the conjugal act rather than of marriage. And this was for good reason. While it is not simply wrong, of course, to say that marriage itself has unitive and procreative meanings, Humanae Vitae's attachment of these to the conjugal act is intended to fortify a very precise point. The inseparability of these meanings, as articulated in Humanae Vitae 12, is intended to correlate with, reinforce, and give an anthropological foundation to the teachings of Humanae Vitae 11, namely, that each and every act must be open to new life. By placing the inseparability in marriage rather than the conjugal act, therefore, the paragraph implies that the totality of married life must be open to the procreation, but not particular marital acts in themselves. This implication would mean that a couple might be able to use contraception for good reasons, such as health or finances, so long as they have generally been welcoming to new life. Contraception would be bad only. Okay. You're forgiven. I'm almost done. I am. I really am. I promise. Although you slowed me down now. I was going at a good clip there. Okay. So Okay, so the implication would mean that a couple might be able to use contraception for good reasons, such as those of health or finances, so long as they have generally been welcoming to new life. Contraception would be bad only if it is used selfishly in order to avoid marriage's overall vocation to having children. This shift of emphasis from particular acts to marriage as a whole was precisely what those who sought to counter Humani Vitae's teaching had tried to accomplish following the encyclical's appearance in 1968 in Summer of Love. In view of what has been said, I've always thought that was significant. The removal of inseparability from the level of act to the level of marriage overall is to reduce the question itself to one of moral evaluation in terms of selfishness and generosity. It fails to grasp the symbolic ontology inherent in the act itself. In reaffirming the whole tradition concerning contraception, Humani Vitae suggests a rich anthropology in line with Gaudium et Spes' treatment of conjugal love. Well, Humani Vitae, in fact, really intended to accomplish what Humani Vitae really intended to accomplish was to safeguard the integrity of the conjugal act itself as an authentic expression of love from the fragmentation of sexuality taking place, broadly speaking, in the culture and represented in the majority report. But the integrity of that love can only be protected insofar as its proper fruitfulness is protected. The interior truth of the conjugal act cannot be separated from the idea of genuine mutual knowledge and becoming one flesh. These achieve their visible fullness in the child. Each conjugal act, therefore, necessarily, precisely as the act of love proper to marriage, is rooted in a fundamental acceptance by each spouse of the other as the potential father or mother of our child together. If this integrity of the conjugal love of conjugal love is lost, then we begin down the road towards seeing the child as a product rather than the fruit of love. But this beginning suggests, but this understanding suggests that tacitly reducing the body to its mechanical functionality. As Dr. Schindler emphasized, we do not yet have an apostolic exhortation, and moreover, the Relazione Finale is a greatly improved document which has studiously avoided many of the imperfection of the instrumentum. My concern is only this. John Paul II had seen marriage in the family as not only the object but also the subject of evangelization. By this I take it to mean that he did not only mean that families ought to go out and preach the gospel, stand on a soapbox or something, but rather that the possibility of evangelization depends on creation, our vision of which depends on an awareness of being born within an order of nature and gift, symbolized and carried out within the order visibly inscribed in the bodies of man and woman in their acts. It seems that much of the debate, on the other hand, assumes that what is at stake is primarily a set of traditional moral norms with more or less significance, depending on one's evaluation of the importance and meaning of the tradition. Thank you.